Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Bug Bounty Redacted. In this episode, I'm going to be going through two things, two reports. One which is about a subdomain that points to an IP that the company no longer owns, and the second one is an open administration interface on a subdomain. So hopefully in this video, you'll be able to understand some of these reports that I've been sending into bug bounty programs. The one thing I do want to preface it with is these reports are from 6 years ago. So this is when I first started doing bug bounty hunting legitimately and like more seriously on the HackerOne platform. So if the reports aren't as high quality as you're expecting, that's because I was just starting off. But I do want to make this series friendly to beginners. And I want them to understand that you don't need to be perfect when you start off. You just need to be putting in the effort and reporting things to companies as soon as you find them. So the first thing is, what are third-party subdomain takeovers? You know, like when there's assets belonging to a company, you can try and find subdomain takeovers. You can try and see if there's DNS records that are pointing to services that are no longer in use by the company, and then take over those services or create an account on those services and take over those subdomains. That's typically what a normal subdomain takeover looks like. But this whole concept of third-party subdomain takeovers is something that, I've actually found quite often in attack surfaces. And it is something that I think a lot of large companies do suffer from when they have such a diverse attack surface and they're using all sorts of different things like CDNs, like Akamai, or they're using things like elastic IPs from Amazon AWS. So in my example here, what I've kind of shown is like a third-party subdomain takeover. Let's say, for example, you were visiting a website on uber.com and you found a subdomain, you visited that subdomain, but the page returned the contents of like Domino's, like a completely different company, not Uber, some random other company. Just for an example, I said Domino's, it returned that content. That could potentially be a third-party takeover. That could be a scenario where there is a subdomain on Uber's attack surface that's actually being controlled by a third party, aka Domino's. So that's what I mean by third-party subdomain takeovers, and that's what I'm looking for when I look at attack surfaces. So what's the risk of these third-party subdomain takeovers? Like, the risk is essentially that a completely separate entity, a third party, has full control over that subdomain that you found and for the company that you're attacking. And that means that this third party could host arbitrary contents on this subdomain and ultimately attack the users if they wanted to. This isn't always the case. So you can mention things such as discovering client-side vulnerabilities such as XSS on the third party's contents on the subdomain takeover. Or additionally, you can also mention the fact that these third-party subdomain takeovers can be sometimes ephemeral. For example, elastic IPs, and the ownership of these IPs change rapidly. You could also mention that you could potentially gain access to this takeover or be the one who is in charge of the takeover or in control of the takeover if you have been able to claim the ephemeral IPs. So things like elastic IP subdomain takeovers, that's a scenario where you could constantly allocate and deallocate elastic IPs on Amazon AWS and potentially be able to do the takeover yourself. So these are the different points that you can get across in your report to demonstrate the impact of third-party takeovers. But generally, this is also the risk of third-party takeovers in general. So how do you discover them? How do you discover third-party takeovers? In my opinion, you've got to focus on the metadata. You've got to look at the company's attack surface holistically. And once you do that, you'll become aware of all the different SSL certificates, the fave icons, and other patterns. Third-party subdomain takeovers are typically found by analyzing this metadata, such as SSL certificates, or even the response of the index page. So for example, let's say you visited example.uber.com, and it was pointing to an Akamai IP address, and the SSL certificate was actually for Domino's.com. This is a huge indicator that this asset is actually no longer owned by Uber, and it could well be a third-party subdomain takeover. Sometimes, as I mentioned earlier, these third-party takeovers are short-lived, so you must constantly be scanning the attack surface to pick these up. What does a report look like? What does a report look like when you report some of these third-party subdomain takeovers? So I start off by saying, hey, there's this subdomain that points to an IP address or service that your company no longer has control of. Here's the subdomain, and when you visit this subdomain, you find that you actually get the contents of McDonald's instead of your company's actual contents that you wanted to display there. And I had a few theories. I said maybe a developer pointed this subdomain to Akamai, but they forgot to remove the entry, leaving this subdomain pointing to an Akamai IP address that's no longer owned or used by the company I was reporting it to. I also mentioned that these were the different indicators that I found that suggested that this subdomain was no longer owned by the company I was reporting it to. The fave icon, the text returned on the page, and things like that. So after I reported this bug, this was something that they accepted and they said, okay, this is definitely not a subdomain that we still control, so we're going to remediate this issue. This report is pretty basic. I do want to mention that this was 6 years ago, so this was when I was just getting into bug bounties, and I wasn't writing as detailed reports as I do today, but I think this was sufficient for the company to remediate this issue. The next thing I want to move on to is open administration interfaces. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, damn, I would never report an administration interface being exposed, where authentication is still required. But I want you to consider this whole concept of defense in depth. And defense in depth essentially says, you want to try and fix any exposure on your attack surface. You want to try and make the time required for an attacker so high that, it's too difficult for them to get into your organization. As a part of defense in depth, one of the things that you probably want to do is lock down or no longer expose any administration panels on the external internet. And this is something that I believe is highly beneficial to companies in order for them to have a stronger security posture when it comes to their attack surface. I want to change the perception that this is something that you shouldn't typically report, because in my opinion, this is something that I definitely do report. And I do think that companies get value out of these reports. I'm not saying that you're going to get paid every single time you report an exposed administration panel, but in many cases, these panels probably shouldn't be exposed, especially if you're thinking about it in defense in depth. Not every program will treat you the same. Some programs appreciate this a lot more than others, but it is still something I still report. In my opinion, administration panels are an easy entry point for attackers in order for them to own an organization, and they should not be exposed externally. So the discovery of administration interfaces. My approach to this is fingerprinting and then enumerating. So it might be easy to just slap /admin/ to the end of a URL and pray for the best. But in my opinion, finding administration interfaces usually requires a better understanding of the underlying technologies first. So the first thing I normally do is fingerprint these technologies using something like Wapalizer or WhatWeb. And once you know what technologies are running, you look for documentation about accessing the admin panel. This will often include the URL that you need to visit in order to access the admin panel. And this will often lead to you finding administration interfaces for the most obscure software out there. I also suggest you perform thorough content discovery, files and folders, brute forcing to find administration panels as well. So what does the report look like? Well, pretty simple. Again, this is 6 years ago, so I was just starting off, but I just said, hey, I found this administration panel at this URL, and it looks like it's quite easy to brute force passwords for the admin user. I could potentially escalate privileges or steal user data from those people who have authorized themselves to this application once I gain access to the admin panel. One thing you'll notice in this report, and just particularly this finding, is that the admin panel was located at /index.php/admin. Now, this is something that a lot of tools may miss, and generally people might miss, because this was actually based on the routing system that they were using as an underlying technology. They were using CodeIgniter in PHP, and CodeIgniter does a lot of routing based on the index.php file. So everything after the index.php file, that's the controller it routes it to appropriately. So that's why I found this particular admin panel exposed, and that's why I think a lot of people missed it. In this scenario, they paid me 1.5 grand, which is quite a lot for an exposed administration panel. I didn't actually have access to the admin panel. I just had the ability to view the admin panel and attempt authentication on the admin panel. So this was a report for this exposed administration interface. Again, I want to thank everyone for tuning in and catching this quick episode of Bug Bounty Redacted. We're planning to release even more episodes, and we're looking forward to releasing them to you and the broader community. Thanks for all your support, and I look forward to presenting again soon.